Wait. That was what he said after the phone call. Not my name, not an apology, just one word pressed flat by the glass walls around us. My hand was already on the door handle. It was one of those office doors that looked clean until you touched it, then every fingerprint showed. Mine was there now under the metal bar. Daniel Mercer stood behind the small conference table with his phone near his ear, although the call had ended. "Ms. Ortiz," he said, "could you sit back down for a moment?" Outside the glass wall, a woman in gray heels passed with a paper cup. She glanced in, saw us standing, and looked away too quickly. I didn't move. A minute earlier, Daniel had been leaning back with one ankle over his knee, holding my resume like it weighed almost nothing. Now he held it with both hands. That was the part I noticed. The hands. The interview had started at 9:30 in a building near the Chicago River. I arrived at 9:07 because late felt like a crime I could not afford. My blazer was navy. Old Navy, not the store, the fact. The lining had a small tear inside the left sleeve, and all morning my thumb kept finding it. I had ironed it before Mateo woke up. "Mom." He stood barefoot by the kitchen table, hair stuck up on one side. "You're going to the job thing." "The interview," I said. He nodded like he understood the difference. I packed his lunch while wearing the blazer. Peanut butter, apple slices, the fish crackers he liked. I wrote his name on the bag because the school kept reminding us. At drop-off, his teacher pointed at my blazer. "Big day." "Oh," I said, "yes." She smiled gently, not the kind that asks questions. In the lobby, a woman had a laptop open. A man in a blue suit whispered into earbuds, saying things like stakeholder alignment. I kept my folder in my lap. Printed résumé. References. 2 copies of the childcare schedule I had made for myself just in case they asked. Nobody had told me to bring that. I brought it anyway, because I thought proof would make me less suspicious. Daniel came out at 9:32. "Lena." He said it like he had read it for the first time 5 seconds earlier. I stood too fast and my folder slid against my stomach. The conference room had a long table, 6 chairs, and one plant in the corner trying its best under fluorescent light. There was a carafe of water on a sideboard with 4 clean glasses. He did not offer any. I noticed because my mouth was dry. For the first 10 minutes he was polite in the way people are polite when they have already decided to be careful. He asked about my old role in nonprofit financial compliance. I told him about audit preparation, vendor reconciliation, grant reporting. Work that sounded smaller than it was. He nodded. "Healthcare logistics can be demanding." "I understand. It's not really a 9-to-5 environment." "I'm comfortable with that." He tapped his pen once against my resume. "You've been out of the workforce for 4 years. There it was. Not a question. I kept my hands folded. "Yes." "Can you walk me through that?" I had practiced this answer in the shower in the car while stirring pasta sauce with Mateo doing spelling words at the table. "My mother had ovarian cancer," I said. "I became her primary caregiver. My son was very young then. After she passed, I took time to stabilize things at home." Daniel looked at the resume while I spoke. Not at me. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said. "Thank you." The words landed between us like something both of us wanted moved aside. He turned the page. "And childcare now. My son is in school. I have aftercare arranged and backup care through a neighbor and my aunt." His pen moved. I watched it. "What happens when he's sick?" I had an answer. Of course I had an answer. "For emergencies, I have coverage." He smiled a little. "Not mean. That would have been easier." "I'm sure you do. It's just that this role requires full commitment." I nodded once. He kept going, maybe because my face did not change. "We've had situations before where people think they can re-enter at a high level, but the pace is different. This job isn't for people who can't fully commit." The plant hummed under the vent. I looked at the water glasses, then at the pen in his hand. I thought about the schedule in my folder, the backup plan, the nights beside my mother's bed measuring pills into plastic cups, the invoices I caught with wrong vendor codes while Mateo slept against my thigh. I could have explained. Instead, I closed the folder. Daniel noticed. His smile faded just enough. "Miss Ortiz, I don't think this is the right fit," I said. He blinked as if that line belonged to him. I stood carefully so the chair would not scrape. "Thank you for your time. He half rose. I didn't mean. I did not wait for the rest. People always found softer words after the hard ones had already done the work. My hand reached the door. Then his phone rang. He looked annoyed when he answered. Daniel Mercer. A pause. Yes, she's here. Another pause. His eyes moved to my resume. No, I understand Marianne Bell is waiting on confirmation, but... His mouth closed. The air changed before his face did. He listened. Then he lowered the phone just enough to stare at me like I had entered the room twice and he had only seen me the second time. Wait, he said. And for the first time that morning he said my name like it mattered. I stayed by the door. Not because I wanted to hear him out, mostly because leaving too fast suddenly felt dangerous in a way I couldn't explain yet. Daniel cleared his throat and looked toward the glass wall. 2 associates were walking past with tablets in their hands. He reached over and pressed a button beside the door. The glass frosted white. That got my attention. A second earlier, I'd been a forgettable applicant with a gap in her resume. Now the room needed privacy. He set his phone down carefully. Please, he said, sit for 1 minute. I looked at the chair, then at him. Number? That's fair. His voice had changed, softer but not warmer, more controlled, like someone trying not to step on broken glass. I kept my bag over my shoulder. What exactly just happened? Daniel rubbed the side of his jaw once. The call was from our executive office. I waited. We're finalizing a workforce initiative partnership with the Bell Foundation. I knew the name before he finished saying it. Of course I did. Marianne Bell's face had been in magazines the last few years. Panels, conferences, women in leadership articles with soft lighting and impossible furniture. I had stopped clicking on them eventually. Daniel picked up my resume again. When they submitted final advisory names, your name was included. I laughed once before I could stop myself. Not because it was funny. Because suddenly I could hear my mother saying, "See, people remember more than you think." I used to hate when she said things like that. Daniel kept talking. Apparently, Ms. Bell personally requested that you be consulted before we move forward. Consulted for what? She didn't specify. That sounds unlikely. I'm aware. He looked uncomfortable saying it. Good. I shifted the strap on my shoulder. The room smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and coffee that had burned an hour ago. Mr. Mercer. Daniel is fine. No, I said. I think we should stay professional. That landed. His eyes lowered briefly. Outside the frosted glass, a blurry figure paused near the door, then kept moving. Daniel pulled out the chair across from him but didn't sit. I owe you an apology. You don't know me well enough for that. I know how that conversation sounded. I looked at him for a long second. You asked what happens when my son gets sick. I did. Do men get asked that here? Silence. Not defensive silence, worse. The kind where someone realizes they never noticed a thing until it was already sitting in front of them. He folded his arms, then unfolded them. We ask everyone about availability. That wasn't what I asked. He looked away first. There it was. Not victory, just truth sitting heavily between 2 people. I finally sat down mostly because my knees suddenly felt tired. Daniel stayed standing another second before sitting too. The conference table was too long for a 2-person conversation. Corporate furniture always felt designed to remind people where power lived. He slid my resume toward himself. I reviewed this last night. I figured. There wasn't much detail attached to your prior role. I left quickly. Why? The question came out before he softened it. I looked down at my hands. My nails were uneven. I'd peeled the polish off while waiting during Mateo's dentist appointment last week. My mother got sick. Yes, but professionally, I mean, your references are unusually strong. I almost smiled at that. Unusually strong. People always sounded surprised when competence came from someone they had already sorted into another category. I worked in compliance, I said. There was an internal fraud issue. Daniel looked up immediately. Financial? I nodded. One of the senior accountants had been moving small amounts between grant allocations for years. Nothing flashy. He understood nobody checked non-profit records carefully unless something exploded. And you found it? I shrugged. There were inconsistencies. That's not a small thing? No, I said quietly, it wasn't. For a second I could smell hospital sanitizer again. My mother sleeping in a recliner beside me while I stared at spreadsheets at 2 in the morning. Mateo kicking lightly inside me back then, the old laptop overheating on my stomach. Nobody knew I was pregnant at work yet. I remembered Marianne standing outside my cubicle one night holding cold coffee. You're still here. There's another discrepancy. You need sleep. I need this number to make sense. Back then I thought if I worked hard enough people would become careful with me. I was still stupid enough to believe effort protected you. Daniel leaned back slowly. Ms. Bell mentioned your work saved the organization. She exaggerates. She said the Federal Review would have shut them down. I didn't answer. Because maybe it would have. Because maybe I had known that at 28 and kept going anyway. Daniel studied me differently now. Not kindly, more like recalculating. I knew the look. I'd seen it at school pickup sometimes when another parent finally learned I used to have a career before becoming Mateo's mom. People rearranged you in their heads once they found context that made you legible again. It was exhausting. I should have reviewed your file more carefully, Daniel said. That wouldn't have changed the question. His face tightened. I wasn't trying to embarrass him. That was the problem. I genuinely wasn't. He tapped the edge of my resume. Can I ask something honestly? I almost laughed again. People usually ask that right before saying something selfish. You can ask. Why didn't you return sooner? There it was. Not judgment this time. Actual confusion. As if 4 years had disappeared mathematically instead of physically. I looked toward the frosted glass wall. Shapes moved outside, meetings, coffee runs, lives continuing. My mother needed 24-hour care near the end, I said, and daycare cost more than my rent. He opened his mouth slightly, then closed it. I could almost hear the calculation happening behind his eyes. Chicago rent, medical bills, aftercare, one income. Reality entering the room late. My wife stopped working after our second child, he said quietly. I looked back at him. He stared at the table while speaking. She was a physician. Past tense. Interesting. And I think I always called it a choice because it sounded better. The room went still after that. Not intimate, just honest for one dangerous second. Then his phone buzzed again across the table. This time he didn't touch it. I watched the screen light up with the name Marissa, Executive Office. Daniel looked at me carefully. They want to schedule a follow-up meeting. With me? Yes. I picked up my folder slowly. Outside, someone laughed down the hallway. Sharp, brief, normal. I stood. Daniel stood too. But neither of us moved toward the door. Because somehow the interview had ended a long time ago, and something else had started instead. That afternoon I sat in Mateo's school pickup line with the engine off. The interview folder was on the passenger seat beside me, half open, one corner bent. I should have fixed it. Instead, I watched parents crossing the street in little clusters. Coffee cups, strollers. One father jogging the last few feet because the crossing guard had already lifted her sign. Normal life? That was the strange part. You could walk out of a room feeling like the ground under your identity had shifted, and meanwhile someone nearby was arguing about soccer snacks. My phone buzzed at 3:17. Unknown number. I almost ignored it. Hello? Lena. I knew Marianne Bell's voice immediately, not because I'd heard it recently, because some voices stay attached to entire periods of your life. Mine probably did too. Hi, I said. A pause. Then softer, you sound tired. I leaned my head back against the seat. I had an interview. I know. Of course she did. A crossing guard blew her whistle outside. Kids started spilling through the school doors with backpacks bouncing against their shoulders. I'm sorry about Daniel Mercer, she said. He's not why I'm tired. No, she said quietly. I didn't think he was. I watched Mateo come out holding his jacket by one sleeve instead of wearing it. He was talking while walking, probably hadn't stopped all day. There's my son, I murmured before I meant to say it aloud. Marianne didn't answer immediately. He's 8 now, right? 3rd grade. I remember when you brought him into the office that winter storm. I smiled despite myself. Mateo had been 3 months old. The daycare closed during a blizzard and I had shown up apologizing before anyone could accuse me of something. He screamed through half a compliance meeting. The senior accountant, Richard, had rolled his eyes so dramatically I still remembered it. Marianne had picked Mateo up herself while I finished presenting numbers. "You kept apologizing," she said now. "I probably should have." "No," Marianne said, "you really shouldn't have." The pickup line moved. I pulled forward 2 car lengths. Mateo spotted my car and waved hard enough for his whole body to tilt sideways. I waved back. "You blindsided me today," I said quietly. "I know. You could have called before putting my name in front of corporate executives. I tried 3 times last year. That stopped me." I frowned down at the dashboard. "What? You changed your number?" "Right. I had. After the hospital bills. After collection calls started coming from numbers I didn't recognize. I changed it and never updated half the world because disappearing felt easier than explaining." Mateo climbed into the back seat and dropped his backpack loudly. "Mom, Eli threw up during math." "Seatbelt." "He did it near the pencils." "Seatbelt first." He buckled himself while studying my face in the mirror. "You had the interview." "Mm-hmm." "Did they like you?" Children asked brutal questions without meaning to. I looked ahead at traffic. "They remembered me." That seemed enough for him. He nodded once and started digging through his backpack for something sticky. Marianne waited until the rustling settled. "Lena," she said carefully, "do you know how many organizations use the reporting framework you built?" I stared through the windshield. "Number." "Most people assume our finance department created it." "That's fine." "It's not fine." Her voice sharpened for the first time. Then she exhaled. I could picture her doing it, one hand against her forehead. "Richard took credit for more than the fraud cleanup," she said. I didn't answer. Because I knew. Not officially, nobody ever said it directly, but I knew. Back then, Richard had this habit of repeating my ideas 5 minutes later in meetings. Same numbers, same language, slightly deeper voice. People listened harder to him. I learned to speak less after a while. "Why are you bringing this up now?" I asked. "Because I found old records during an audit review." "That was years ago." "Yes." Traffic crawled forward another few feet. Mateo hummed to himself in the back seat while peeling the label off a water bottle. Marianne lowered her voice. "You disappeared so completely after your mother died that I let myself believe you wanted distance." The word sat heavy between us. Not accusation. Regret. I remembered the funeral reception in my aunt's church basement. Ham sandwiches, store-bought cookies, people touching my shoulder as they passed. "You're strong." "Your mother was proud." "Call if you need anything." Then silence afterward, weeks of silence. Grief wasn't dramatic most of the time. Mostly it was administrative, paperwork, bills, laundry multiplying in corners while you forgot what day it was. "You know what the worst part was," I said before thinking. Marianne stayed quiet. People kept calling me resilient. The word sounded ugly in my mouth. Mateo leaned forward between the seats. "Mom, can we get nuggets?" "Maybe." "You always say maybe when it means no." Marianne laughed softly on the phone. There it was again. A whole history living underneath tiny sounds. "You were good at the work," she said after a moment. "That's not nostalgia talking." I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. Outside, 2 mothers stood near the curb talking while checking their phones every few seconds. One wore scrubs under a winter coat. Exhaustion recognized exhaustion. "I don't even know if I remember how to do it anymore," I admitted. "You do." "You can't know that?" "I can," she said. "Because people who build systems don't stop seeing patterns just because life punishes them for leaving." I swallowed hard at that. Not because it was emotional. Because it sounded true. And truth feels dangerous when you've spent years shrinking yourself into survival-sized pieces. When I got home, there was an email waiting. Subject line: follow-up discussion request. From Daniel Mercer. Professional wording, careful tone. At the bottom, 1 extra sentence. "I realize now your resume explained less about your capability than your absence." I stared at that line for a long time. Then I looked toward the kitchen. Mateo was sitting at the table doing homework with his tongue pressed against the corner of his mouth, completely serious about spelling words no one would remember tomorrow. The apartment smelled faintly like detergent because I'd forgotten wet laundry in the washer overnight and had to run it again. Ordinary things. But for the first time in years, I had the uncomfortable feeling that maybe my life had not disappeared. Maybe it had just gone unwitnessed. The second meeting happened on a Thursday morning. Not at their office. Daniel suggested a coffee shop halfway between downtown and the hospital district. Neutral ground, I guess. Somewhere without glass walls and executive assistants moving past every 30 seconds. I got there first. The place smelled like espresso and wet coats. A woman near the window was crying quietly while pretending to read emails on her laptop. Nobody looked at her. That felt very American somehow. I chose a table near the back. When Daniel walked in, he spotted me immediately and slowed down for half a second before approaching. He wasn't wearing a suit this time. Dark sweater, collared shirt underneath. More human, probably intentional. "You found it okay?" he asked. "I grew up here." "Right." He stood there another second. "Can I get you something?" "I already ordered." He nodded and went to the counter anyway. I watched him wait in line behind two medical residents still wearing badges from the night shift. One of them looked about 23, exhausted already. Daniel came back with black coffee for himself. No food. People trying to keep control rarely ate during uncomfortable conversations. "I appreciate you meeting me," he said. I stirred my tea even though nothing was in it. "You said this wasn't another interview." "It isn't." "Okay." He glanced around the room once before leaning back slightly. "I spoke to Mary Ann Bell. And she told me more about your work there." I said nothing. Daniel rubbed his thumb against the coffee cup seam. "She also told me you used to sleep in the office during the fraud investigation." I looked up. "That's dramatic." "Is it inaccurate?" "Sometimes I stayed late." "With a newborn at home." I looked back down at the tea. Mateo wasn't a newborn yet during the investigation. I was pregnant. But correcting him felt unimportant. "People romanticize overwork after enough time passes," I said. "That's not what she was doing." The coffee machine hissed loudly behind us. Someone dropped a spoon. I noticed Daniel watching me carefully now, not with admiration exactly. More like he kept discovering evidence that didn't match the version of me he had built too quickly. "I need to ask you something," he said. "You keep saying that." A tiny smile appeared, then disappeared again. "Why didn't you fight harder for credit?" There it was. The question people always asked after the damage was already done. I leaned back slowly. "Do you know what Richard used to say whenever I corrected him in meetings?" Daniel shook his head. He'd laugh a little and go, "Lena, let's not make this emotional." Daniel's jaw tightened. That was enough. At 28, in a room full of older executives, I shrugged lightly. "Yeah, usually." The crying woman near the window finally stood up and left without finishing her coffee. Nobody stopped her. Daniel stared into his cup. "My wife said something similar once." I waited. She worked emergency medicine. After our second daughter, she asked to reduce overnight shifts temporarily. He paused. Her department head told her she seemed distracted lately. The words landed carefully between us. Not confession, recognition. "And what did you say?" I asked. His silence answered first. Then I told her maybe they had a point. Outside, a bus rolled past, spraying gray slush against the curb. Daniel exhaled through his nose once. "I've been thinking about that conversation for 3 days." "The interview?" "Yes." I watched him carefully now. Not because I trusted him. Because people rarely admitted discomfort unless something underneath it had started breaking open. "You know what bothered me most?" he said quietly. I didn't hear myself while I was saying it. I looked away toward the counter. A barista was wiping down a machine with mechanical focus. 2 college students laughed too loudly near the pastry case. Life continuing, always. When someone has a caregiving gap, Daniel continued, corporate language translates it into risk, instability, divided priorities. That's because corporations are built around people with invisible support systems. He looked at me sharply. I continued before I lost nerve. Somebody picks up their kids. Somebody handles medications. Somebody waits for the plumber. And the people benefiting from that support pretend they built themselves alone. Daniel didn't interrupt. So I kept going. My mother used to organize medication trays while doing bookkeeping at night. My father called her naturally organized. A short laugh escaped me. She was exhausted, that's what she was. Daniel stared at the table now. I could see it happening in real time, pieces connecting backward through his own life. His wife leaving medicine. The assumptions afterward. The way certain sacrifices became invisible, the second women absorbed them quietly enough. I owe my wife an apology, he said. That's between you and her. I know. I checked the time on my phone. Mateo's school conference was at 4. I still needed groceries afterward. Real life sitting there beside every supposedly important conversation. Daniel reached into his leather folder and slid a document toward me. Not a contract. An internal hiring review report. I frowned. You're not supposed to show me this. Probably not. I scanned the page. Retention concerns. Re-entry adjustment uncertainty. Long-term availability risks. All corporate phrases, smooth and sanitized. But underneath them I could hear the translation clearly. Mother. Caregiver. Complication. I looked up slowly. This is what you really thought. Daniel held my gaze this time. Yes. Not defensive. Not softened. Just true. And somehow that hurt more. Because honesty removes your last excuse to misunderstand someone. I looked back at the report. Then at him. You know the worst part, I said quietly. What? I spent years trying to become easier to trust again. My voice stayed calm. But something inside me shifted while I said it. Not anger. Not even sadness. Just sudden clarity. I had been carrying my life like evidence. As if surviving difficult years required documentation before it counted as real. Daniel looked like he wanted to say something. Instead, he nodded once. Small, careful. Like he understood this moment no longer belonged to him. Outside snow had started falling lightly over the street. People kept walking through it anyway. 3 days later, Marianne invited me to a strategy meeting downtown. Not a formal board meeting. She made that clear twice. Small group, she said over the phone, mostly operational people. Operational people. The phrase made me smile a little after we hung up. In every organization, operational people were the ones quietly preventing collapse, while someone else gave interviews about vision. The meeting was on the 22nd floor of a building overlooking Millennium Park. Gray February sky, salt stains near the revolving doors downstairs. I almost turned around before going in. Not dramatically, just physically tired. Mateo had a fever the night before. I'd slept in fragments beside him while he kicked blankets onto the floor every hour. At 6 a.m., I almost emailed Marianne to cancel. Then Mateo opened one eye and said, "You already ironed your clothes, though." So there I was. The receptionist gave me a temporary badge. Visitor. Funny how quickly institutions labeled people. Inside the conference room, 4 women and 2 men sat around a polished walnut table with laptops open. Coffee cups everywhere, half-eaten granola bars. Real meetings always looked slightly messy once people stopped performing professionalism. Marianne stood when she saw me. Older now, more silver in her hair, same direct eyes. She hugged me before I could prepare for it. "You came." "Barely." She smiled. "I'll take barely." Nobody in the room seemed confused by my presence, which confused me. That unsettled feeling stayed while introductions moved around the table. Director of Workforce Strategy. Talent Systems Consultant. Partnership Counsel. Nobody said inspirational things about resilience, thank God. Then Daniel walked in. Late. Not dramatically late, 3 minutes maybe, but enough that several people glanced up. He stopped slightly when he saw me there already. Interesting. So Marianne hadn't told him either. "Sorry," he said to the room, "traffic near Wacker." Nobody cared enough to challenge it. He sat across from me, loosened his scarf once, and opened a folder. No tie today again. I wondered if that was permanent now or if I was imagining meaning into small things. Marianne started the meeting without ceremony. "We've been reviewing re-entry hiring models for caregivers," she said, "and most of them are garbage." A few people laughed softly. Not because it was funny, because everyone there already knew. For the next 40 minutes, people discussed retention statistics, hiring gaps, leave structures. Numbers filled screens. I understood all of it immediately. That surprised me less than it should have. One consultant mentioned candidate perception instability. Another talked about workforce interruption stigma. Same language, cleaner packaging. I watched Daniel listening instead of speaking, mostly taking notes. At one point, a woman named Priya leaned back in her chair and said, "The issue is employers view caregiving as evidence of divided loyalty." I looked down at my notebook before answering. "No," I said quietly. "They view it as evidence somebody might eventually prioritize a human being over productivity." The room stilled slightly. Not dramatic, just attention shifting. Priya nodded once. "That's fair." Marianne looked at me over her coffee cup but didn't interrupt. That was something she'd always done well. She knew when not to step on a moment. The legal counsel started discussing implementation timelines. I noticed Daniel watching me once or twice while I spoke. Not admiration. Recognition. Different thing entirely. Around noon, the conversation shifted toward internal culture assessments. That was when a younger HR director named Elise said very casually, "Most executives don't understand caregiver strain personally." Silence. Then Daniel spoke for the first time in nearly 20 minutes. "That's not true." Everyone looked at him. He kept his eyes on the table. "My wife left emergency medicine after our second child." Nobody moved. "She wanted reduced overnight shifts temporarily. I told her it probably made sense." He paused. I realized now I was mostly relieved somebody else would absorb the logistical pressure. No one rushed to rescue him from the statement. Good rooms don't do that. Elise folded her hands slowly. "What happened afterward?" Daniel gave a short laugh with no humor in it. "She never went back." The room stayed quiet another second. Then the meeting continued. Not because the moment wasn't important. Because adults in professional rooms often survive by pretending emotional revelations are merely additional information. But something had shifted. I could feel it. Later, during a short break, I stood near the windows overlooking the park. Snow crusted the sidewalks below in gray ridges. Tiny figures moved through the cold, carrying coffee cups and backpacks and grocery bags. A whole city managing invisible burdens. Daniel stepped beside me, careful not to stand too close. "You were right," he said. "About what?" "The interview." I crossed my arms lightly. "That narrows it down." A faint breath of laughter escaped him. Then he looked down toward the street again. I genuinely thought I was being practical. "You were." He frowned slightly at that. I continued before he misunderstood. Practicality just isn't neutral. He absorbed that quietly. Behind us, people resumed talking around the conference table. Laptop chargers, calendar deadlines, someone asking where the restroom was. Real life again. Daniel glanced toward the room. "Marianne wants to offer you a consulting position." My stomach tightened immediately. Not excitement. Fear. Because being needed again sounded dangerously close to being consumed again. I don't know if I want to become someone's inspirational case study. "You won't." "You can't promise that." "No," he admitted, "I probably can't." I appreciated the honesty more than reassurance. He slipped his hands into his coat pockets. "For what it's worth," he said carefully, "I don't think they brought you here because you survived hard things." I looked at him. "I think they brought you here because you notice systems breaking before other people do." The words hit harder than praise should have. Because deep down part of me still believed my useful years had already happened. And for one dangerous second beside that window, I could feel another possibility trying to exist. The consulting contract sat unopened on my kitchen counter for 4 days. Every morning I moved it slightly to make room for something else. Mateo's permission slip. Mail. Groceries. By Friday evening, the envelope smelled faintly like garlic because I'd set a takeout container on top of it without thinking. That felt appropriate somehow. Big decisions rarely arrive under dramatic lighting. Usually they sit beside unpaid electric bills and sticky countertops while your kid argues about screen time. "Mom." Mateo leaned against the fridge holding a spoon. "Are you gonna do the job?" I rinsed rice in the sink. "It's not exactly a job." "Then why are you stressed about it?" "Good question." I shut the water off. Outside, snowmelt dripped steadily from the fire escape. I dried my hands slowly. I think I forgot how to belong in rooms like that. Mateo frowned. You talked a lot at the dentist. That's different. You corrected the dentist. I looked at him. I did not. You said the insurance code was wrong. I stared another second before laughing despite myself. Right. I had. The dentist's office almost charged me $400 because someone entered the procedure incorrectly. I spotted it before signing. Systems breaking before other people noticed. Apparently that part of me never left. Mateo pointed his spoon at the envelope. So maybe you still know how? Kids sometimes walked directly through emotional fog without even noticing it existed. Later that night after he fell asleep, I opened the contract at the kitchen table. Part-time consulting. 6-month term. Workforce reentry policy review. Flexible schedule. I reread flexible schedule 3 times, not because I didn't understand the words. Because nobody with authority had said them to me without suspicion attached in years. My phone buzzed around 10. Daniel. I considered letting it ring out. Then answered. Hi. You sound surprised. I am. A pause. I wanted to let you know the partnership board approved the initiative. That was fast. Marianne pushed. I could hear traffic in the background on his end. Then a turn signal clicking steadily. You driving? Parked outside my apartment. There was something strangely humanizing about that. An executive sitting in a parked car finishing difficult conversations before going inside. My wife signed a lease today, he said suddenly. I blinked. For an office. I sat back slowly in my chair. She's going back to work. She's opening a small urgent care practice with another physician. His voice carried something complicated underneath it. Pride, regret, maybe both at once. That's good. Yeah. He exhaled quietly. I don't think I realized how much smaller she'd become in our house. The honesty of it caught me off guard. Not because men never noticed these things. Because most waited too long to say them aloud. The kitchen clock ticked softly above the stove. You know, Daniel said when you walked out of that interview, I thought you were offended. I was. No, I mean, he paused. I thought you were reacting emotionally. I smiled faintly at the wording. And now I think you were seeing something clearly before I did. Outside my window, someone laughed down in the alley. Bottles clinked, a car door slammed. Chicago never really went quiet. I almost didn't come to the meeting, I admitted. Why? Because I was tired of entering rooms where people translated my life into liability. Because competence becomes exhausting when nobody believes it until a powerful person confirms it first. Because part of me had started mistaking invisibility for peace. But I only said I wasn't sure I remembered how. Daniel was quiet a moment. Can I tell you something uncomfortable? You usually do. A soft laugh. Then, after our interview, I pulled hiring data from the last 5 years. I straightened slightly. Okay. We rejected 73% of applicants with caregiving gaps longer than 2 years. I closed my eyes briefly. Not shock. Recognition. I'm guessing nobody wrote caregiver bias in the reports. Number. What did they write? Concerns about continuity, adaptability, long-term retention. I leaned back in the chair again. Language doing what language always does. Cleaning blood off the floor. Daniel continued carefully. I don't think most managers even realized what they were doing. That doesn't change the outcome. I know. And for once it sounded like he actually did. Monday morning was the first official workshop session. Not glamorous. A rented training room with bad carpeting and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly exhausted. Perfectly realistic. About 30 people sat around circular tables. HR directors, operations managers, recruiters. Coffee everywhere again. I stood near the projector screen reviewing notes while people settled in. My hands were steady until someone walked past behind me and whispered, "That's her." I turned slightly. 2 women near the back table looked away too fast. Not malicious. Curious. I recognized the feeling instantly. People always became interested once a woman's suffering had professional framing attached to it. Marianne opened the session with introductions. Then she handed the floor to me. No dramatic announcement, no inspirational biography. Just Lena helped build the assessment framework we'll be reviewing today. Simple. Accurate. Enough. I walked to the center slowly. 30 faces looking up. Some skeptical, some distracted. One man already checking email under the table. Real people. I looked down at the clicker in my hand. Then at the first slide. Retention risk analysis. The old language. The familiar language. For one brief second, I almost slipped back into apology mode. Softer voice, smaller posture, easier to digest. Then I remembered the interview room. The water glasses untouched beside Daniel's hand. The way I had spent years preparing evidence that my life was legitimate. I set the clicker down. And without planning to, I pulled the temporary conference badge off my blazer. Returning professional. I stared at it once, then placed it face down beside my notes. A few people noticed. Good. I think I said calmly, we should start by examining which kinds of interruptions we treat as respectable. The room went still. Not because I sounded powerful, because I sounded certain. And certainty from women like me still unsettled people more than anger ever did. By October, the city started smelling like cold pavement again. Chicago always changed suddenly in the fall. One week, people sat outside restaurants pretending summer might stretch a little longer. Then overnight, everyone walked faster and stopped making eye contact. Mateo liked that time of year. It smells like school, he said one morning as we crossed the parking lot. I laughed. That's not a smell. It is. He adjusted his backpack higher and ran ahead toward the entrance before I could answer. I watched him go. Long legs now, taller than he realized. The Velcro sneakers were gone, untied laces instead. Little evidence of time passing. I stood there another second after the bell rang. Not rushing. That still felt unfamiliar sometimes. The consulting work had settled into something steady by then. Not glamorous. Mostly policy reviews, hiring audits, training sessions with exhausted managers pretending they weren't defensive. Sometimes people changed. Sometimes they only learned better vocabulary. Still, the work mattered. A month earlier, a hospital network in Milwaukee revised its caregiver leave return policy after one of our assessments. Quiet change, no headlines. But somewhere, maybe a woman wouldn't have to explain daycare costs to a stranger across a conference table anymore. That counted. I stopped at a coffee shop before heading to the office Marianne loaned me twice a week. Small place, burnt espresso, students pretending to study. The barista looked up and smiled. The usual. That almost made me emotional. Not the coffee. Being expected somewhere. When I got to the office, Daniel was already there sitting in the conference room with reading glasses low on his nose. I paused at the doorway. He looked older lately. Not physically exactly. More like someone who had started noticing the weight of his own habits. You're early, I said. So are you. There were printed reports spread across the table beside him. Employee retention analysis. Bias review findings. 6 months ago, those documents would have sounded abstract to me. Now I could see people hiding inside every statistic. Daniel removed his glasses. How's Mateo? Apparently 4th grade is a full-time identity now. That sounds right. I sat across from him and opened my laptop. The ease between us still surprised me occasionally. Not friendship exactly. But no performance left either. A real thing, rare enough. Daniel tapped one of the reports. We've had 3 senior managers request revised caregiver flexibility policies voluntarily. That's good. One of them was me. I looked up. He gave a small shrug. My wife's clinic opened last month. How's she doing? She's exhausted. A faint smile appeared, which is apparently different from miserable. I smiled back before I could stop myself. Outside the conference room, someone rolled a cart down the hallway. Phones rang somewhere farther off. Ordinary sounds. I used to think life-changing moments announced themselves properly. Mostly they happened while fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Daniel looked at me carefully for a second. You know, he said I almost called you after that first interview to defend myself. That would have gone badly. I know. His mouth twitched slightly. I kept rehearsing explanations in my car. That's because explanations feel safer than guilt. He nodded once, then leaned back in his chair. I reread your original application recently. I raised an eyebrow. Why? I wanted to figure out what exactly I missed. And He looked embarrassed by the answer. Nothing he admitted, that was the problem. I understood immediately. The resume had always been enough. The issue was never missing information. It was the story people attached to absence. Daniel glanced toward the window. When someone disappears professionally for caregiving, people assume competence disappears too. I closed my laptop slowly. My mother used to say something strange. What? She said women become most invisible while doing the things everyone depends on. He absorbed that quietly. She was right. Yeah, she usually was. That afternoon I left early for Mateo's school presentation. Months ago I would have apologized 3 times before leaving a professional meeting for something at school. Now I just stood up and said I need to go. Nobody questioned it. Small changes mattered too. The elementary school cafeteria smelled like glue sticks and tomato sauce. Parents filled folding chairs while children fidgeted near a cardboard solar system hanging from the ceiling. Mateo spotted me immediately from the stage area. His shoulders relaxed the second he did. That hit harder than most things these days. One mother beside me still wore hospital scrubs under her coat. Another parent typed emails one-handed while balancing a juice box. Everybody carrying entire private worlds around silently. The teacher dimmed the lights. Children started presenting state history projects with terrifying confidence. Halfway through, my phone buzzed once in my purse. I ignored it, then ignored it again. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel guilty. Mateo stood near the front, holding poster board slightly crooked. His hair needed cutting again. He cleared his throat dramatically. My project is about Chicago after the fire, he announced. A few parents smiled automatically. I watched him push forward anyway after losing his place halfway through the second paragraph. Not polished. Not perfect. Still certain he deserved to be heard. Something tightened quietly in my chest. Afterward, while parents folded chairs and gathered backpacks, Mateo ran over. Did you see when I fixed the date mistake? I did. I almost panicked. But you didn't. He grinned. Outside, the air smelled like rain coming. We walked toward the car slowly. Mateo swung his presentation board against his leg. Mom? Mm-hmm. Are you important at your job now? I looked ahead at the darkening street. At parents loading children into cars, at buses groaning past, at ordinary life happening everywhere all at once. Then I looked down at him. No, I said softly. And for the first time, I meant something good by it. I think I'm just visible now. If this story stayed with you, maybe it's because you've known what it feels like to disappear inside responsibility, to become useful before becoming seen. And maybe you also know how powerful it feels when someone finally looks directly at you and understands there was a whole life happening there the entire time. The end.